I'm speaking to you from the island of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. I don't know if you've heard of it, but I mean, the irony isn't lost on me that I'm in New England speaking to Old England. My family's had a house here for something like 40 years, I guess, maybe even 50. From the early 70s, we had a house here. And actually, when we bought it, a sea captain absolutely is convinced that our house was the site of a Revolutionary War incident in which apparently a colonial maiden fought off British soldiers on the front steps. So I thought that was very exciting and a great connection to England. But I am here now. And of course, when I'm in this house, I'm transported back to Thanksgiving, because for 30 plus years, every year like clockwork on Thanksgiving, our family came up here and celebrated. And not just my immediate family, but the entire Hungarian matriarchy. There was my mother, Sharika, and her sister, Rozsika, and Boriska. And they in turn married Hungarian survivors who had a ton of kids. And so, you know, we always came up here, and honestly, to at least superficially, it seemed like a normal American Thanksgiving table. We had the obligatory turkey, the pumpkin pie, the cranberry sauce, the stuffing. But upon a further observation, it was very clear this was not at all an American household. I remember one Thanksgiving, I heard two of my uncles casually talking at the Thanksgiving table, and it sounded something like this. I lived in a pit in the earth for 2 weeks. You think that's something, Shmuley? I was in a pile of corpses for 10 days, pass the turkey. And they would casually tell these war stories like they were talking about, you know, a sale at Kmart or at Walmart. And I remember distinctly, though, realizing that that was the moment when I learned that evil was something that you have to cohabitate with, not something that you have to defeat, like most of my rather naive American friends believed. So it was a wake-up call for me. But if it weren't for my uncles occasionally, or my aunts occasionally, very occasionally scattering a few stories, I would have known nothing. Because my mother was one of those survivors who never talked about the Holocaust. I'd ask her, she'd get angry or run out of the room. She was absolutely silent, and I knew absolutely nothing from her. But as I think many of you know, that secrets have this way of coming out anyway. And ours did, particularly at the holidays, like Yom Kippur, when I remember the upright piano in the corner of the living room was covered with so many Yorkshire memorial candles, one for every member of the family that had died in the camps, that the glow was blinding. Now, Rosh Hashanah, we had these neighbors who were also survivors with no family of their own. And they had these bizarre Hungarian names like Chippy, Mitzi, Tushy, Mushy. Anyway, we had to call them aunt and uncle and smile as they shoved money in our pockets. And I remember Hanukkah, when my mother had this gorgeous silver menorah, and she would fill it with this rainbow of luminous, colorful candles, and she'd stick it in the window in New Jersey where we lived. And then no sooner did she do that, she'd quickly pull the shades down, lest anybody know we were Jewish, even in suburban, safe, sleepy New Jersey. And of course, Thanksgiving, right? So we would invite the only other Hungarian couple we knew on Martha's Vineyard Island, the Franks, and they would come over. And Mr. Frank had stolen a Nazi fork out of the kitchen when he was a prisoner there. And I remember it was this heavy silver fork with a swastika engraved in the handle. And he only took it out from his basement once a year to carve the turkey at Thanksgiving, no explanation given. So secrets have a way of coming out. I mean, my mother definitely never spoke about the Holocaust, but you know, it was in our food. Like we had 3 refrigerators. We had enough Carnation instant milk to feed a small country. And I remember one night I was so hungry, I went into the freezer to see what was there, and about 40 frozen chickens came falling out on my feet. So I started to put them back, and I saw that one had been there for so long, it was green and moldy. So I threw it out, and my mother almost had a heart attack. It turns out that green mold was really a roll of $200 she'd hid inside the head of the chicken. She said, "You never know when it can all be taken away." And of course, my father then admitted to me that he'd been finding money hidden for years in the strangest places. We never, ever heard about the Holocaust, not once. But, you know, I had hyper radar. I knew how to interpret things. Like, for example, our mundane, everyday childhood activities that should have been joyous. For example, walking down the block to get my brother from kindergarten. I was 3, he was 5. I'd hold my mother's hand, which was kind of way up high, and we'd walk down Virginia Avenue in New Jersey, and the route was always the same every year. You know, we'd go past the candy store, and if I was lucky, I'd get an ice cream cone. Then we'd walk past the mean-spirited Italian twins, the LaPuzzo twins, who are always up to no good. And then we'd walk by this factory that was always churning out billows of gray smoke. And like clockwork, every time we walked by, my mother would squeeze my hand so tight that I would sense terror in her. They didn't understand it. And years later, I figured out, you know, it must have reminded her of the crematoria that her father and brother were killed in. Now, the Jewish day camp used to open up their lake every Sunday for families. And so we would swim there in the summer. And one day my mother piled all of us kids in the back of the station wagon, me, my brothers, my cousins, and we were singing and laughing on the way to the lake. But up ahead, there was a construction roadblock, just a simple construction roadblock. But there was flashing lights and police in uniforms redirecting traffic. And when my mother saw that, she screeched the car to the side of the road. She told us kids to get down and made us lie on the bottom of the car. And she went in the trunk and she took a blanket out to cover us until she could talk her way out of the roadblock. You know, to my parents, everything was survival. Like even the most joyous acts became symbols of survival. So I used to love my shopping trips with my mother. And there was a famous department store in New York called B. Altman's Department Store. And it had this restaurant inside that was made to look like a Southern plantation mansion. You know, it was like something out of Gone with the Wind. So we decided to have lunch, and it was so crowded, they hadn't cleared the food away from in front of us. And sitting in front of my mother was a half a sandwich on a small china plate. And when she saw the sandwich, her face dropped in that, I called it the look. I mean, I knew it was about to happen. It was one of those rare moments when she was about to tell me something about the Holocaust. And, you know, part of me wanted to protect her from those memories, but part of me was so desperate. I was like hoarding any crumb I could get, like Hansel and Gretel. So I let her speak. She said, you know, I haven't thought about this in such a long time, but we were in the labor camps in Lithuania chopping wood. And I remember we were so hungry, we used to sneak berries off the trees and pop in their mouths when no one was looking. And we had to sleep on logs. And I remember that rats used to run on them. And I think that's why I don't like when the cat jumps on the bed today. But I also remember I was standing in a corner chopping wood, and my mother and sisters were somewhere down there. And a laborer from over the fence saw me, and he took pity on me, and he threw me half a sandwich at my feet. I said, do you remember what kind of a sandwich it is by any chance? She said, yeah, it was a ham sandwich. She said, and I bent down and I picked it up because I was just going to have the smallest little bite. I knew I had to share it with my mother and sisters. They were starving. I was just going to take a taste. And suddenly the tears just started pouring from her face. And she said to me, I never meant to eat it all. I swear to you. I just couldn't stop. And then there was total silence. You know, a silence so noisy that it kept me up that night. And of course, in the next minute, we were back to talking about pantyhose and pocketbooks, and the subject was never brought up again. She did not need to tell me any stories about the Holocaust. I knew, right? It was in our names. My Hebrew name is Rachel. It's an international name given to me, so in case I have to flee the country, it's easily translatable. Growing up, I was told to be a doctor. That way, in case I have to escape, I'd have a skill I could use anywhere. Now, my American name is Lisa, right? It's an all-American baby boom name, kind of name you'd find on a plastic pen in the drugstore. Like whenever I was in grammar school, whatever year I was in, when the teacher would call my name, at least 4 people would scream, here. And I always felt lucky about that. All the other children of survivors I knew were named after relatives that had died in the camps. In Hebrew school, there was a Shmuli and a Bertha and a Moishi. I didn't have that problem. My name was Lisa, and Lisa was anonymous, and anonymous was good. We only made donations anonymously. We weren't allowed to put bumper stickers on our car because nobody could know our political affiliations. When my parents bought their house from an Irish family, they never, ever bothered to change the front doormat. And 50 years later, when they sold the house, it still read Maloney. We only drove American cars because American cars fit in better. And fitting in was so important. Let me tell you, I did it incredibly well. I was like all the other kids, right? I was great at kickball and hopscotch and stoop ball and stickball. And I remember when the principal made the great feminist proclamation that girls in 1967 could wear pants to school for the first time. I was the first kid to go out and get purple polyester bell bottoms, right? I even got the lead in the 6th grade class play. It was called Living Up to Abraham Lincoln. I had the lead. I was Mrs. Carter, and my mother rolled my hair in banana curls for the occasion. I was like all the other kids at school. There was just one difference between me and everyone else. Well, they were dreaming of the future. I was dreaming about the past, about my mother's past. Because when I was growing up, camp did not mean summer camp. I'd be sitting in school, we'd have just taken a test, there'd be some time left before the bell rang, and so I'd start to stare out the window, waiting. And suddenly, the safe world would melt away, and I would see things that I knew no little kid my age was supposed to see. Boots, guns, knives, whips, pistols. At any moment, 3 men in black jackets could come whipping through the door, take their guns out and go rat-tat-tat and shoot us all dead, or even worse. They could say out now, and they'd march us down the hall, and we would never be seen again. Then the bell would ring, and I'd get out my Charlie Brown lunchbox, and I'd go home with everyone else. It's strange because my mother never talked about it, and in place of it, my imagination just ran amok. There was always this dark hole where her past was. Like, in my mind, it was as if her life began in America after the war. Like, she was like a tree that you saw off in the middle, stick into the ground and, hope it grows upright. Through and through, my mother was Holocaust, but my father, he was pogrom. The difference between them was time, right? His family had come over after the pogroms in Poland, and they had time to take their roots, stick them into the American soil and cling on for dear life. And that's what they did on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and eventually in Brooklyn. And so in turn, my father had this really happy childhood, And it occurred to me recently that exactly at the same moment, my mother was scrounging in the dirt looking for any rotten potato to eat. My father was sitting at the soda fountain in Brooklyn, drinking egg creams and having ice cream sundaes. At exactly the same moment that my mother was marching in the snow at gunpoint, my father was marching across Eastern Parkway into the botanical gardens with his sister, where he was playing games all day. So naturally, to my father, the world was this wonderful place. And of course, to my mother, his perspective was absurd. She used to say to me, your father's side of the family, they're all crazy. I'd say, what, and your family isn't? She'd say, yes, but in a normal way. I mean, to be honest, she was a little bit correct. He did have a little bit of a crazy family. He had an Aunt Gertie who chased your Tom Jones all over America in a white van with her daughter. And he had a cousin, Danny, a physicist, who disagreed with Einstein. And until he died, the license plate on his car said E does not equal MC squared. But the few times I was allowed to meet the Lipkins, they were really nice. And I told my mother, I said, Mom, the best part about the Lipkin side is they're completely unjudgmental. She said, that's because they're simple. Simple people don't judge. I didn't understand why she resented his side of the family so. Maybe it was because they were from a different class than she was, or maybe it was because of their roots. that gave them security, or maybe, I mean, just maybe it was because his parents were alive and hers weren't. But whatever the reason, I'll never forget the day we went to clean out my grandfather Samuel Lipkin's apartment after he died. Here's the strange thing. My grandmother died 1 year early, but exactly on the same day. I thought this was really odd and I didn't understand why, but my mother said to me, it's obvious why. They didn't want you to have to make 2 trips to the cemetery. So anyway, we started with the big sofa in the living room covered in plastic slip covers. That's part of everyone's American Judaic history. And then we moved the big, huge Zenith television with those rabbit ear antennae, you know. And then there was this big box in the middle of the room filled with bric-a-brac and junk, and a jewelry box in the bottom, which I lifted up and opened up. And it was like Captain Kidd's treasures to me. It had sparkling earrings and a roller skate key and a Timex watch. And when my father saw something, his hand dove down and he scooped it up and he said to me, here, I want you to have this. It was my mother's. And it was a cameo pin. And I'll never forget the face of the woman on that pin. She had like alabaster skin and a hair coming down and little lips. It was beautiful. And I think I must have looked absolutely elated because I remember my mother said to me, Yui, look at the face on that child. She's walking on the 9th cloud. I said, Mom, I'm excited. She said, don't make a scenery. And my father tried to reminisce too, but I think it was too difficult for her because she said, Yui, it's such junk. I can't stand it. I'm getting sick. I'm sick. I want to go home. Take me home. So I watched my father struggle between trying to attend to his memories of his mother and trying to take care of my mother, which of course, in the end, he always did. But I didn't care because I now had something I desperately wanted, right? I now had roots in the form of a pin, something that finally connected me somehow to something. For my mother, I had no roots, I had no stories, and I had absolutely no family objects. Or so I thought. About 15 years ago, I was invited for Yom HaShoah to speak at the B'nai B'rith Museum in Washington, DC. And I decided to invite the only friend I had in Washington, a man named Yatzik, who is the head of acquisitions and collections for the Holocaust Museum. And after the talk was over, the performance, the audience started barreling questions at me. Where did your mother, where was she in the camps? How did she survive? All these questions that I couldn't answer. And I said, look, as I explained to you, I really don't know. She didn't tell me. There were no stories. The only stories that I have were the ones that came out accidentally. For example, I told the audience, I recently was at a wedding and there was a family friend who had been in one of the labor camps with my mother and her sisters. And she told me they had found a swatch of blue fabric on the ground and it was big enough to cut headscarves for them. And they fashioned them. And so they came to be known as the Blue Kerchief Girls. Suddenly Yatzik raises his hand in the audience and he says, but Lisa, you know we have that blue kerchief in our warehouse, don't you? Your aunt had it in her closet all these years, along with a wool sweater someone had knitted her out of socks in the camps. I thought you knew. Knew? I can't tell you how many times I played hide and go seek in that closet. I mean, had it been brushing up against me? Was it underneath me? I mean, I thought I was the only thing in hiding in that closet. I mean, I was so visibly shaken up. They had to give me a chair and some water. But immediately after the performance, I made an appointment with Yatzik to go the next day to the warehouse where they stored all these goods that people had donated somewhere outside of Boston in an industrial complex. And all night long, I was tossing and turning, wondering, what would it be like finally coming to terms with my past. But, as fate would have it, the horrors of the present far outweighed the horrors of the past. I got lost on the Beltway in Baltimore and I was zooming around and around. It was a nightmare. I was cursing the objects. I just want to get on with it. And I finally pull up and there's no sign, just a number on the door. And I look in this glass window and I see like a circus poster with a smiling clown and it says Le Cirque and cute little floral chairs. It sort of looked like a kindergarten. and I knocked on the door and this young woman answers. She says, yes. I go, is this the Holocaust Warehouse? She goes, yes, you must be Lisa. Yatzik's waiting for you. Go right in. She was like a student nurse in a root canal clinic. And I kind of knew the room I had to go into because I could see people coming out of the room and pulling off their rubber gloves and putting them in a box. So I started walking down the hall, but my knees almost buckled and I had to go into the bathroom for a second and just sit. And I gathered myself and I finally had the courage to walk into this room. It was an enormous room. You could have fit 50 Mack trucks in there with these huge gray stone pillars and hundreds of ceiling fans creating a low permanent hum. And everywhere there are workers with tape measures and rulers measuring objects on tables. And I know that they're dressed in regular clothes, but in my mind, I see them wearing white lab coats. And I really feel like I'm in a morgue. And there are signs up, Auschwitz, prisoners' belongings, Mengele experimentation. And Jacek comes over to me and he puts his arm on my shoulder and he says, pretty amazing, isn't it? And as if he could read my mind, he says, do you want to look in one of these drawers? And I say, yeah. And he takes me to the Auschwitz section. He says, these were objects that were collected at the gates of Auschwitz as people entered. And he said, to be honest, this drawer is a metaphor for the entire story of the war. And he opens up the drawer and it's hundreds of rusted scissors, every shape and size. He says, look, that was for the manicurist. That was for the tailor, the barber, and a little child. And he closes the drawer. And then we walk over to another row of shelves and something is covered in white paper. And when I lift it up, I realized these were umbrellas confiscated at the gates of Auschwitz. And of course, at the time, they would have reflected the personalities of the people that brought them with shapes and patterns and colors and sizes, but all the canvases had deteriorated and the wood was warped and all that remained were these wooden slats sticking straight up like arthritic fingers. And then on the other side were suitcases with the names still on them, Schoenberger, Grun, Baum. And I thought, oh, the irony of this, I wonder which one will be selected to go up to the museum and which one will stay in hiding. And then down the hall, he points to this huge wrought iron fence with grapes and a Star of David, but it's slashed and there's a swastika. And he says, oh, that was the gate of a Jewish Polish cemetery that was burned and destroyed. And finally, an odd table at the end of the room with a scoop and a hole. He says that was an extraction table where they pulled teeth out and the hole where the blood drained. But anyway, I see Jacek's assistant, Susie, motioning to me from a distance. And she's got this huge box, the kind of box you'd put a wedding dress in or a prom dress. And she's laying out the objects that I've come to see on a table. She calls me over. So, I gather my courage and I walk over to the table and I look down. And it's so embarrassing. I had to start laughing. She brought the wrong objects. She put out baby clothes. And my aunt is like 6 feet tall, Oh. And then it hit me. No. My aunt was 10. My mother was 6. That was my aunt. That little girl was my mother. It was a beautiful wool sweater with buttons covered in gray wool with red and green stripes woven. And I wonder, who was this woman that knitted this for my aunt? And is she still alive? Does she have any story she can tell me? And then I see the blue kerchief next to it. And I go to touch it and Susie stops me. She grabs my hand. She says, you can't touch that. The oil on your fingers will deteriorate the fabric. You have to wear these. And she hands me these plastic gloves. I mean, not only did I want to touch it, I wanted to sleep with it. I wanted to take it home with me. I mean, since when had it become so inaccessible? I mean, it went from the inaccessibility of my aunt's closet to the inaccessibility of a government warehouse. And it had neglected to stop with the one place it should have, right? Us, the children. Wasn't this my rightful legacy? So I asked Susie if I could be alone with the objects, and she left, and I misbehaved. I took off the gloves and I touched it. It was like a very soft blue denim with just one little hole in fringe, but perfectly clean and pressed, just like my aunt's. And I picked it up and I put it to my cheek and I started to cry. I mean, I really started to bawl. But I'm not even sure why, because on the one hand, while it was larger than life, in the other hand, it was smaller than I ever could have imagined. But I can tell you one thing, touching that object, physically seeing it, coming to terms with my mother's past in such a concrete way, it was like a flash of insight. And that flash, it gave me just enough light to go back and take my rightful place in the shadow. Because the truth was, up until 15, 20 years ago, we did have to be in the shadow. And even if I talked about the issue surrounding children of survivors, it wasn't the right time, and nobody really wanted to hear yet. There were stories to hear first, and there was testimony. But I wonder now that we are the tellers of the story, and we're not in the shadow anymore, the shadow is gone. How do we do it safely and wisely? How do we tell the story without using the Holocaust solely as our seeing eye dog? And I think the answer is to be honest with ourselves, to ask ourselves questions and be honest. What does it mean to inherit trauma? Because we did, let's be honest, the children of survivors, the grandchildren of survivors, we are the children of trauma, of PTSD. And what does it mean, and how does it affect us? And we have to start really looking at that if we're to move forward, I believe. And I can answer you on an individual level because I've had many years to think about it. For starters, I'm childless, and I don't think that's an accident. I inherited such fear from my mother, who followed me in cars on dates, who had me convinced that she could survive Auschwitz, but not me crossing the street. And I believed her for a very long time. In fact, the only way I was able to deconstruct those myths was by moving across the pond to Amsterdam. But by then I was too old to have kids, but I didn't think I could keep anything alive, let alone a child. I also realized that not all of this is cultural. There's been some fascinating epidemiologic studies done on not just survivors, but their offspring. And not only do survivors have exacerbated production of stress hormones, but so do their children. So we have inherited a cortisol production exacerbation. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking very technically, but we have inherited an epigenetic component to all of this that makes making stress-free decisions rather difficult unless we do a lot of work and a lot of intervention. But I also will tell you that I've inherited a tremendous capacity for resilience and survival. And there've been more than one occasions, especially when New York was in a very bad period back in the 80s and 90s, when I talked my way out of situations that could have been potentially very dangerous with villainous characters in New York. And I know that has to do with my mother and what I learned from her. But let me speak collectively for a minute, because this is so important, and I think maybe more important than anything I've talked about today. How do we collectively move forward proactively without solely using victimization and reactivity as our definer of Jewish identity? I have reason for concern, and I'm going to share stories with you that I have never told anybody, but I think it's important for you to know this. Yom HaShoah is a big period for me, and I'm invited to speak in many, many places. And a couple of years ago, I was invited to speak in Potomac, Maryland, at a Jewish day school, a very, very nice suburban neighborhood, middle-class school. The man that hired me worked for the State Department. He was a second-generation survivor, but he was a parent at that school, and he was asked to head the Holocaust committee for that day or that week. And as I drove into the schoolyard, I saw and you have to try to remember, have you ever seen pictures or seen in person these huge suburban American parking lots, these big schools, very wealthy schools? As I drive in, I see black train tracks painted on the ground leading to the front door. And over the front door of this school, it says Arbeit macht frei, the same words that were at the gates of Auschwitz. When I questioned him as to why, I don't know that that's necessarily the best way to to teach the lessons of the Holocaust. He didn't know what I was talking about. We got in a big argument. Another story. I was invited to another Jewish day school in Manhattan, a fancy school. The teacher who hired me was a second generation child of survivor. And 1 a.m, the night before my performance, she called me up and said, "Do you promise you'll make the kids cry?" I said, "Well, I may make them cry and I may make them laugh, but what's important is the discussion we have afterwards. You must give me the half-hour question and answer period so we can talk about what we do with this information." So the next day I come in, she's cut out the entire question and answer and asked a survivor to share the most gruesome war stories imaginable. Atlanta, they instituted a Holocaust awareness as part of the curricula, and the second generation woman in charge of it was so excited to show me the video that is now part of the curricula, in which she shows the most grotesque footage of bodies piled up. I mean, you've seen the worst Holocaust footage. And then she said to me, "Isn't it great? Isn't that exciting? I really want to get them." You know, these are 3 of, if I tell you, dozens of experiences that I've had like this. But the most interesting and perhaps the most telling, and my final story, is with the Board of Jewish Education. Now, they were on the right track. They wanted to bring Judaism to life in a proactive, joyous way. So they asked me to help teachers do that through storytelling. And I had worked a lot with New York City public school teachers, showing them how to bring history to life. So I decided to model the workshop after that. And one of my favorite activities is where I tell teachers to ask their students to become objects on a dinner table in different periods of time. So become an object on the Thanksgiving table during the colonial era or during the Dutch of New Amsterdam, and describe what you see on the table. And inevitably, when I put teachers through this, they say things like, "I was the turkey that smiled proudly. I was the cup of wine and we made a toast." Then I did a modification with the Jewish educators in the room at the Board of Jewish Ed. I said, "Become an object on the Pesach Seder table, the Passover Seder table, and tell me about it." And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every single teacher was a persecuted object. I was the matzah that fell on the ground and was crushed. I was the glass that smashed by accident. I was the wine that dripped on the ground. The only teacher who wasn't persecuted was the Israeli teacher, but everybody else was. And so it's made me really, really question how we go forward. If these teachers, with all best intentions of delivering a joyous, proactive, joyous Judaism, were so unaware that they themselves were walking around with that victimization, how can we really move forward in a mindful way? Am I saying not to tell the story? Of course not. But I'm saying that because we are the children of trauma, we must be mindful. We must think about what we are doing in a very, very serious way. Now, I have a lot of hope because, Deborah, as you know, I've been working for the last few years with European Jewish communities, programs such as Next Generation, and I've seen stunning things. I'm so excited about the young professionals and what they're doing, whether it's coming out of the amnesia of communism or the victimization of Holocaust, and they're doing remarkable things. So I have every faith. But in concluding, I just want to say that in order to move forward, I want to encourage all of us to not just celebrate the oys of Judaism, but also to be mindful of the joys of Judaism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions for Lisa, please write them on the chat. But I'll start. Anyway, that was wonderful. It's such a refreshing and interesting way to, your approach to teaching about the Holocaust, and it's really, really, really interesting. I enjoyed it. Is that okay? Am I allowed to enjoy it? Was I allowed to laugh?
I'm thrilled you did.
The guilt of laughing at your.
No, thank you. Thank you.
So what sort of age are these children who, when you went to the teachers in the schools, the teachers said,
I've been asked to do Holocaust education or using storytelling to teach Holocaust for every age group. And, and the question comes, when is it too young? which is a whole other discussion. But, it depends for me. Sometimes metaphor is very important, so sometimes if the children are so disconnected from the Holocaust, like third, fourth generation American, sometimes I'll just try to do theater improv that has to do with racism and hatred and violence and draw parallels to it. It's not always a good idea to be direct. One of the things that storytelling is so effective for and with is the metaphors that can still let people draw their own conclusions without really sending them over the top and over the edge. So I'm a big fan of using it.
Yeah. So, I mean, when did you start realizing that this talent you have for performing could be used in this way? What's the story behind the storytelling, if you like?
Actually, it's very embarrassing and it's not Holocaust related at all. So I don't know if I should reveal this to you, but I will since you asked. I was actually trying to be an actress in New York. And of course, that meant in the late 80s, early 90s, pre-internet days, that meant taking a job either as a waitress or as a secretary while you were auditioning. And it was a hot summer, it was August, and I was a secretary in somebody's office. The owners were in the Hamptons. There was no internet, so I was sweating, no air conditioning. So I picked up a magazine. It was a Smithsonian Institute magazine. And I started to flip through it. And there was an ad that summer. There was a cruise going up and down the Hudson River, a historic cruise. And I said, ooh, I want to be on that cruise. So I had the chutzpah. I wrote them a letter. And I said, I'm a colonial storyteller. Don't you want to hire me for the cruise? So about 1 week before the cruise was leaving, they said, you're hired. But we're not going to let you come with us. We're pulling into South Street Seaport. You got to walk on, tell your New York stories and get off. And I was freaked out. I didn't know what to do. So I went to the library and got a book of New York folktales and legends. And I became absolutely mesmerized by these stories, which brought history to life in a beautiful way. And it turns out it was almost all single widows who were kind of drinking and not listening anyway, but they somehow liked me and paid me. And I did it a few times. But it really set me off on this journey of using stories to bring history to life. And so that's how it happened. Sort of embarrassing, but.
No, it's a great story about your storytelling. Now, you told this story about when you visited the archive and you held the jumper and you took your gloves off that you shouldn't have. I had a similar experience as well, actually, because my mother, and we're going to be discussing this on one of the panels tomorrow. My mother had one possession from her mother, which was a leather handbag. And she donated it to a museum without telling me about it. I didn't know about it.
Yep.
I'd never seen it. It'd never been shown to me. She'd never spoke about it until after she donated it, years afterwards. And it's quite far away, the museum. So it took me a few years to go and visit it. And then I had to wear the purple gloves. And so I completely,
And I'd love to hear from people who are watching too, because this is interesting thing about storytelling is one story begets a very similar story. This is not uncommon. I get this a lot where survivors can't talk to their kids or show them directly. I mean, actually, the first time I heard my mother tell her story was German television. They came to interview me and she told the Germans, not me. So it's very interesting. I don't understand the psychology of it. I can guess, as we all can, but that is a fairly common story.
Yeah.
One woman in a storytelling workshop I had said her mother, she knew about a ring that her mother had used. It had 4 diamonds. And the story was that they had used all but 1 diamond to bribe their way at different places during the war in order to survive. And she knew that it was somewhere, but the mother refused to tell her where. And only after she died did she find the ring, and it came to her. And so she took it to the jeweler just to see the value of the diamond. And the jeweler said, listen, I don't know what to say to you. It's totally paste. Are you upset? She said, upset. It's fantastic. We really stuck it to the Nazis. You hear a lot of these stories. Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that your mother told her story to the German film crew, that's also something that resonates with one of our panels earlier, where we had some young German non-Jewish volunteers who come and work with Holocaust survivors and organizations. And one of three of them who've worked with the AJR over the past few years. And one of them said she was visiting this survivor, and she told her story. And she said, you're the first person I've ever told it to. And I believe they were speaking in German, because I think that was the point, that they were going to visit Germans.
You know, I'm a daughter of a scientist. And I do think, I've thought a lot about this, and I don't think it's just cultural. I think there are some, like my mother for sure, physiologically could not, there was something about revealing a story that set, you know, that I think she kept alive by not telling. I think there was that perhaps she would have been in big trouble if she had. And I think there is a physiologic component here, a neurologic component that we need to really look at. How different traumatized individuals can process or not process grief and trauma, and when it comes out and how it comes out. And I think this is such an important thing that we really need to think about. When everybody was pushing her to tell the Shoah Foundation about her story, I was like, no, she has figured out, she's alive now, she's 94, though she says she's 90. And I'm sure that's why, because she, you know, at everyone else's detriment, but she didn't do it. And this is my suspicion. But I'd love to hear from all of you. So you can unmute yourself. I'd love it.
We've oh, don't do that. Don't say that. We could be
sorry. Chaos.
We do have a message over chat which says, "Dear Lisa, thank you. I enjoyed your joy throughout, while also hiding under the rug whilst at the road hold up. Oh yes. What alternatives have you found as successful in storytelling of our second generation past, instead of I hid in a pile of dead bodies for days?"
Say the question, what the actual question was what?
What alternatives have you found are successful in telling the story of our second generation past, instead of I hid in a pile of dead bodies for days?
Well, that's not our past, that's our parents' past. So, I mean, I think one of the solutions is I'm trying to tell my story, how it affected me, and reference my mother's story, but in relation to my own story. Maybe you could clarify the question. Is it how do we tell the Holocaust story to others, or how do we tell our own story, second generation story?
Yeah,
I think there's a distinction.
Well, if the person wants to just clarify that would be great.
Yeah, but I obviously, I have this and this again was my survival. I have this way of like always partnering the horror with the humor. That's my own personal way. So like, you know, if there's anything too morose, I immediately try to make it light. And I think that's the way I end up navigating the world as well, for better or worse, because there's problems with that too. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is to use, as I said, metaphor. So to tell parallel stories from other cultures, other genocides, if you want, and then reference it in a way that you can tolerate. And again, the other thing is to not be literal. This is a storytelling principle, which is the story really about bodies piled up, or is it about callousness and disregard for human life? If you go beyond the literal, beyond the physical, and you look at what is the emotionally relevant, psychologically relevant aspect of that story, then you can really get at how to tell it in a way that works. I think we all too often get caught up in a literal description as opposed to a psychological or emotional one. So the storyteller always looks for emotional truth and then hangs the facts on it, if that makes any sense.
So storytelling is a science as well.
Completely, yeah.
So, and if you're talking to, I mean, obviously our audience here, I imagine are very, most of us are Jewish and of the second or third generation. But if you're speaking to an audience of people who aren't necessarily Jewish and younger children, for example, do you put in the same sort of jokes? I mean, does it work?
No, you have to, I mean, I always have to, obviously, but even when in Amsterdam, you know, you can't reference Bloomingdale's because they don't quite know where that is. And you always have to change your references when depending on who you're talking to. I don't know if you want to hear like, well, this is a really bad story.
Yeah,
but I was hired to do a Holocaust workshop with kids in a high school in Omaha, Nebraska, about 20 years ago. The principal was Jewish, but it was a public school, and they were doing a Holocaust chapter. These kids knew nothing. They didn't have relatives in the Holocaust. You know, they're as far removed as you can imagine. And so I decided to put them through theater improv that looked at racism and hatred. You know, like we acted out issues surrounding racism and hatred. And then we drew parallels to what had happened in the Holocaust, but in a way they could understand. And I thought the workshop went so incredibly well. And afterwards, the principal was furious. He called me and he started screaming at me, "You call that? What does that have to do with the Holocaust?" He said, "You know what I do?" He said, "I pretend to be a Nazi throughout the few weeks we're teaching Holocaust. And I march into their room, surprise them, and I scream orders." He goes, "And then at the very end, I get them to stand up and I try to march them out of the room, but they try to resist, but I'm ready for them." And he takes out a plastic water pistol and he shoots it and it hits me in the forehead. And I said, "Thank you very much." And I left. These are the kinds of things I'm seeing on the road. Not now as much, but I mean, I will tell you, that's why I'm giving you this cautionary tale, because if we're not ready psychologically to get out of the reactive phase and into the more thoughtful, proactive phase, then we're going to be in trouble. So it's a cautionary tale.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people in the audience are proactively already telling their family stories and educating, or they're thinking about it, or obviously they are invested in the subject, and that's why.
That's good.
So I just want to thank you so much for your time.